Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. I am Heather Thompson, Director of Internet Marketing for Medmarc. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to kick off today's presentation titled, Ripped from the Headlines. Medmarc's risk management team discusses lessons learned from life sciences in the news and what to watch for in 2019. Kate Klaus and Courtney Young, two attorneys in Medmarc's Risk Management Department, are going to break down some of the biggest headlines from this last year. Kate, author of Life Sciences Guidebook, An Introduction to FDA Regulation and a Framework for Successful Navigation, focuses on legal matters faced by participants in the life sciences industry, specifically FDA regulatory compliance. She brings her prior experience in navigating the FDA landscape to Medmarc, where she works with colleagues in-house as well as with policyholders in developing and strengthening regulatory compliance strategies in an effort to mitigate product liability losses. Ms. Klaus is a graduate of the Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and the College of the Holy Cross. Courtney Young, in addition to speaking engagements and publishing articles on product liability risk management for the life sciences industry, brings to Medmarc the development of resources on product liability avoidance and regular correspondence with brokers, policyholders, and underwriters in efforts to evaluate and mitigate product liability risk. Ms. Young is a graduate from the George Mason University School of Law and the University of California, Santa Barbara. There are so many headlines to choose from, so without further ado, I'm pleased to turn it over to Courtney, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Heather. So this has now become our annual webinar where we in the risk management team look at what's gone on in the last year, where life sciences companies and the industry made the news, and see if we can discern any takeaways to help guide our life sciences friends. So today we're going to talk about mainly 4 topics, and then we have kind of a lightning round where we'll just look quickly at different news items making headlines in the life sciences industry. So I'll start looking with an opioid update. I'll turn it over to Kate, who's going to talk about the digital health pre-certification program. I'll talk a little bit about medical device cybersecurity, what's going on there in both industry and from regulatory agencies. Kate will talk about the OTC Monograph reform, and then we'll finish it up with the lightning round, as I mentioned. So to start off, opioids. I'm not going to spend too much time on this topic, as I know we're probably pretty familiar with it at this point. But there are a couple of points I do want to make. I want to say if you end up wanting more information on the status of opioid litigation and what the future holds, our Vice President of Claims, Sonia Valdez, spoke in more detail about it in last month's webinar, and you can find that on the Medmarc website right now. So looking at headlines from this past year, really what we see is that this epidemic is, at the top of national consciousness. I think West Virginia has really been an epicenter of the crisis in many ways, and it's important for us because it really draws particular attention to the sheer number of opioids that were distributed throughout the state as compared to actual residents. And this is important because it really kind of casts a shadow and suggests fault on the part of opioid manufacturers and distributors. This is the kind of volume that sort of shocks the conscious and makes these actions sort of more difficult to defend. So this opioid litigation is unlike other mass torts we've seen in recent years, not only because of the sheer scale, but in who is bringing suit. So these cases are unique in that many of the plaintiffs are government entities, both state and local governments, and they're alleging, sort of for the first time in this kind of context, that opioid manufacturers and distributors should be liable for the cost to the public of treating opioid victims. So just recently, at the beginning of this month, Georgia became the latest government to file suit. It joined 29 other states now that allege drug companies kind of perpetuated this nationwide crisis and encouraged doctors to overprescribe. So what does this mean for life sciences companies? And that's kind of why we're here today, to talk about not just what's going on, but what are the takeaways? So although we're all familiar with the vastness of this issue, I think there are 3 points that are especially salient for life sciences companies. First, I think it's not just drug manufacturers that need to be prepared to be dragged into litigation. As plaintiffs and really the plaintiff's bar sort of run out of defendants, but the attention, the national consciousness remains on this product class, I think makers of drug delivery systems like pain pumps are likely to face more scrutiny and may see some of this litigation. Second, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for makers and distributors and really any companies sort of interacting with this class of products to get insurance coverage. Carriers are responding to this by excluding the products altogether. This is done in a variety of different ways, from flat-out product exclusions to exclusions on the type of plaintiffs that can bring suit. So companies need to be diligent in checking with their broker and carrier to see how products are being treated by their policies. Makers of drug delivery systems and companies that interact with these products, whether in an R&D, a packaging, or sort of an other ancillary service, they need to do the same and ascertain whether they're being swept up in these product exclusions. Finally, I think we need to keep an eye out to the future, and this is where I would refer you to Sonia's webinar for more detail, but I think we need to sort of understand that this might be a sign of things to come, that government entities might regularly join in on mass tort actions and efforts to recoup healthcare costs from the use of so-called bad products. This could really be, not unique to opioids, but like I said, a sign of things to come. So I think those are the three takeaways from this epidemic. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate for our next topic.
Thanks, Courtney. Our next topic is the Digital Health Pre-Certification Program. The 21st Century Cures Act was signed in December of 2016 by President Obama. It had garnered strong support from the medical device and life sciences in general industries because it demonstrated the goal of improving efficiency in getting new therapies to market so that they could reach patients who needed these new treatments. It did have some opposition, primarily from consumer watchdog groups who are concerned that the legislation went too far in watering down FDA's review process, or their ability to limit their review process, which could possibly allow ineffective or unsafe products to reach customers. However, the Act did target FDA's approval processes as ripe for improvement, and as part of the implementation of this legislation, FDA has been breaking down the new framework into more bite-sized pieces as a way of introducing the industry participants to how the regulations will change. A part of that became the Digital Health Innovation Action Plan. In addition to clarifying the specific software provisions of 21st Century Cures, the plan also set forth a new framework for evaluating medical devices, and specifically software as a medical device. This is the Digital Health Pre-Certification Program, or Pre-Cert. Typically, FDA evaluation of new products starts with the product itself. They look at what it intends to do, how it intends to accomplish this, whether there are similar devices on the market, whether it's implantable, invasive, life-supporting. Pre-cert turns that approach on its head and focuses on the developer first rather than the product itself. Because software can change so rapidly and programs can be downloaded onto so many different connected mobile platforms, the old oversight methods which were intended to focus on the hardware became too clunky and cumbersome to keep up with the changing products. And think about software products which can push out updates every week or month versus hardware products which might have years between revisions of the product line. The regulations needed to keep up with the changing products, and there wasn't really a regulatory pathway in place for them to do so. It's really important that the regulations evolve with the industry because any failure on their part to do so, it really hampers the industry's ability to respond to product problems and potential adverse events in a quick manner. So FDA decided to use this framework to sort of get out of the way of developers while still maintaining safety for patients. So what does this mean? The basis for Pre-Cert is a demonstration of a culture of quality and organizational excellence, as well as a company's commitment to monitoring the real-world performance of their products in the U.S. market. FDA started by identifying qualities that support a company's ability to put a high-quality product onto the market, instead of their traditional approach of looking at the actual output, the actual product itself. In addition to the systems the companies have in place for creating software products, the agency is also looking at their ability to monitor the real-world performance of the product and respond quickly to any problems that might arise. FDA wants companies that have demonstrated their capability to build and test and monitor and maintain a safe and effective and secure software product to be able to do so, but they need them to demonstrate that they can meet or exceed FDA's standards first. So what the agency is going to do is assess software developers based upon the rigor of their practices in software design, testing, clinical assessment, and real-world performance. FDA evaluates these practices already, but now they typically do that when they go and inspect a company's facilities. Instead, this new paradigm is going to incorporate them into the pre-market review for the software products that they're putting into the market. If the company's practices are deemed appropriate, it would allow them to go through a faster and more streamlined review of the product itself, and also to use their post-market performance data to support the safety and effectiveness of their product. This works using 4 key factors. The first is FDA's excellence appraisal of the company's practices and capabilities, including its responsiveness to product problems. So a company that has contractors as their developers rather than an entire in-house department might not be well suited for this program. The excellence appraisal process is still being refined. FDA is trying to find a balance between standardizing the procedure across the agency, but still offering flexibility that can accommodate companies of various sizes and specialties. This isn't geared toward one type of company or one type of product. It is intended to be applied more broadly than that. The second component is the review determination, which looks at the review parameters that would be applied to the product. So right now, the scope of Pre-Cert is limited to software as a medical device, but later FDA may also incorporate software in a medical device or software that could be considered a device accessory. Their review of the product is going to adhere to the current agency practices. So they would not review non-device functions of the software that is coming through the streamlined review. They're not going to review device functions that are 510K exempt. It's going to be limited to the same type of functions and performance that they would evaluate right now. The device would then, or the software as a device would then go through the streamlined review of all of the elements that require FDA oversight for reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And then after the product reaches the market, there's a two-pronged surveillance, both of the software's continued safety, effectiveness, and performance, as well as of the company's performance. FDA is going to be watching to see how the company monitors the product and responds to any issues that arise to ensure that it is maintaining its overall culture of quality and operational excellence. The excellence assessment, appraisal, is not a permanent designation. There are several factors that could lead to a company needing to have that status reevaluated. Whether it is consistent issues coming up with a product that the company has not been able to address, or other concerns in their operations, whether it's noted in the post-market performance data or in an FDA inspection, it is possible for them to have their status in the program reviewed. It is not certain when the program will launch widely. There is a pilot program in process right now. It was kind of a big deal among industry participants. There were more than 100 applicants to participate in the program, but FDA selected 9 companies, really larger players in the mobile and software market. The process as FDA is developing it is really intended to be quite transparent. FDA is evaluating comments that are submitted through its website every 2 weeks. They really want to have the feedback of potential users of the program as they are designing this new paradigm. They're also conducting interactive sessions with all of the pilot participants, and these are open to the public. They are public webinars that anyone can register and join to hear how the pilot subjects are experiencing the program, what they think needs to be changed, how any flaws they see in translating the regulations to business operations. And it's part of the new approach FDA has professed in wanting to be a more business-friendly entity. They're trying to limit the burdens that are on industry participants. So we'll see if that actually happens. And I will turn it back over to Courtney for our next topic, which is cybersecurity.
Thanks, Kate. So I think that's a good segue. So the Pre-Cert program is kind of demonstrating FDA's focus on software and internet connectivity, and that deals with software as a medical device. And then I'll talk a little bit more about their focus on medical devices that have software and internet connected components. So cybersecurity made plenty of headlines in 2018, and I think we can expect that to continue this year. A lot of them centered around the increased focus from regulators and how that focus translates into changes in 2019, and that's what we'll be watching for. So what these headlines tell us is, and what we need to know going into this year, is that medical device cybersecurity remains at the forefront of the industry's and of the regulators' priorities. There has been significant developments in this area from government entities, with the FDA releasing its latest guidance in October last year, and the Department of Health and Human Services releasing what they called a call to action at the end of last year. So I'll discuss both of those in a little bit more detail in this section. So looking first at FDA's new guidance, they put this out in October of 2018, and I just wanted to highlight a couple important things about the guidance. First, it's an update to the guidance finalized back in 2014. And in the commissioner's statement sort of introducing it, he acknowledges that it's an update and attributes the need for the update to the rapidly evolving nature of cyber threats. So I think we can expect more guidance, and this probably will remain unfinalized or not finalized for years to come as they respond, as they get industry comments and technology evolves and they update accordingly. Secondly, this is part of FDA's continued emphasis in the total product life cycle approach, and that's now a vein we see running through most of FDA's new guidance and regulations. The TPLC approach, as it's called, contemplates that device companies should manage and emphasize patient safety from conceptualization and design of the product through commercialization and ongoing safety monitoring. In other words, through the product's whole life cycle. It emphasizes the importance of collaboration and communication between departments, which has sort of been notoriously a problem for life sciences companies in that departments tend to be siloed, and whereas patient safety improvements can be made in one area, they're not understood in another. So this needs to happen at each phase of the product's design, manufacture, and sale. Now, applying this approach to cybersecurity, the FDA wants device makers to be considering and mitigating cyber risks at conception, designing them out where possible, addressing them in IFUs where not possible, and probably most importantly in this area, monitoring and maintaining the product after sale. So providing those updates, those patches, and periodically assessing its ongoing vulnerability to cyber attacks once it's in the field. So the most important provisions of this latest guidance document are the additional information being recommended to be included in pre-market submissions. The guidance suggests a cybersecurity bill of materials be included, and this details what components of the product may be vulnerable to cyber attack and what the device makers have done to address and mitigate cybersecurity risk. Finally, the guidance incorporates some of the work NIST did in its framework for improving critical infrastructure. And that's a really great resource for device makers that have some software components and/or internet connectivity to their devices. That's on the NIST website, but it looks to be that they were sort of at the forefront developing these standards, and now other agencies are, incorporating them by reference. In addition to this being important from a regulatory and a patient safety standpoint, we always have to remember to look at these kind of guidances from a product's liability perspective. So even though this is a guidance, it's not mandatory, it's not the law, it's not even a final guidance, it is something plaintiffs can point to in a product's liability case. It's something plaintiffs can use, if not complied with, to suggest the device maker was a bad actor, even if the injury or the property damage that forms the basis of the plaintiff's case was not directly related to a risk that should have been addressed in the bill of materials or should have been mitigated pursuant to the guidance. So I like to bring that perspective whenever a new guidance document comes out, or a new regulation for that matter, or a new set of industry standards. We have to bear in mind what non-compliance would look like to a jury in a product's liability case. So also included in the guidance document is what the FDA envisions as a good security risk management report for a trustworthy device. This would include a system-level threat model, a list of all cybersecurity risks that were considered in the design phase. Again, this is that TPLC approach we mentioned earlier. A list of all cybersecurity controls established. Obviously, this should correspond to the risks identified. A list of testing done, a matrix linking the controls and the risks, and the software bill of materials that cross-reference with a national database and includes whether and how vulnerabilities were addressed, or if they weren't, why they weren't addressed. This is a tall order for device makers, and I think this will be sort of the biggest burden or pain that comes with this new guidance document. So something else that happened at the same time that FDA published this guidance is they entered into a memorandum of agreement with DHS. This is sort of, it's unique in some respects, but in reality it's sort of acknowledging this kind of long-standing relationship that they've had. They just formalized this and established a new framework for information sharing. So now DHS and FDA are going to coordinate more to address medical device cybersecurity. Some key provisions of this agreement are DHS's National Protection and Programs Directorate, which is a division of DHS, can now assist FDA as an independent third party evaluating and assessing the impact of medical device vulnerabilities. It's important to note that neither of these, FDA or the NPPD, the division of DHS, they won't be undertaking these evaluations of individual devices, either at the submission stage or any other time. They'll be performing sort of more general risk assessments. As part of FDA's clearance or approval of device, they will not do any independent testing of the device, and they have repeatedly made clear that this is the role of the device maker and not of the agency itself. So it's important to realize that this, third-party evaluation isn't changing FDA's purview or role in assessing cybersecurity vulnerabilities of a device. The NPPD will also coordinate with FDA on alerts and advisories related to medical device cybersecurity, and these will now be published by both FDA and DHS. I would say that the takeaway here is that we can expect to see more enforcement actions centered on cybersecurity. FDA is really ramping up what it expects of device makers, and I think we can expect that to correspond to an uptick in enforcement actions focused on that. So what does this mean? I think what this new guidance and what the DHS partnership means, obviously new information should be submitted with 510(k) submissions. As I said, device makers must keep an eye on emerging and developing industry standards. And that's not just from FDA, but including from NIST and industry organizations. And most importantly, that these standards can form the basis of a plaintiff's negligence case in the event of a data breach, bodily injury, or property damage, if one of those arose out of a cyber vulnerability that arguably could have been avoided by adherence to one of these standards. So how does this translate into product liability? Obviously, we're product liability carriers, so this continues to be our focus. So any of the vulnerabilities identified by the HHS and the FDA can be a case against a device maker for product liability. So let's recall sort of To back up and give sort of an overview, under products liability, a product can be defective in one or more of three ways. Warning defects, or failure to warn, are probably the most common, and most of our panel of defense attorneys, when we surveyed them, they indicated that, at least in part, this is because these types of claims are easiest for plaintiffs to prove. They merely need to show that had they been warned about a particular hazard, they would not have incurred the injury. In cybersecurity, this claim could take the shape of an allegation that the device maker's failure to warn of any cyber vulnerability. Manufacturing defects allege that the device was manufactured improperly, which rendered the product less safe. This is a potentially easy case to make from a cybersecurity standpoint. I think it could take the shape of an allegation that the manufacturer failed to appropriately patch the device, so that despite its safeties or design, the device was rendered unsafe. And then finally, design defects allege that there was a safer alternative design that the device maker could have reasonably used and failed to do so. I think this allegation also could be easier in the cybersecurity context than traditionally, again, because they can point to a device maker's failure to comply with any of these newly developed cybersecurity guidances and standards to suggest that a safer alternative design would have just featured compliance with one of these standards. So next, turning to what HHS has done, which I mentioned at the beginning. So released at the very end of last year, I think it was December 28th, HHS released what they called a call to action and a document called New Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices. Now their audience was healthcare providers, but I think it's interesting to look at what's being communicated to healthcare providers about medical device safety and security and vulnerability. So what can medical devices expect from this? I think healthcare providers are looking for more accountability from them. We can expect, and this is what we've seen so far too, is contracts that are pushing responsibilities onto device makers for ensuring the safety of their devices and the interoperability with the hospital network and other devices that may be on the network. So they expect robust protections to be in place for infections, that even infections that might already be present on the hospital network. So the document itself identified 5 threats to healthcare providers, and the 5th among them was attacks against connected medical devices that may affect patient safety. So they're really bringing to healthcare providers' attention, that medical devices are a source of cyber vulnerability. And obviously, in turn, healthcare providers are going to turn to medical device makers and say, what are you doing about this, and how do we insulate ourselves? So I wanted to put these up. These are both straight out of the document, and they identify the medical device vulnerabilities primarily as patches not being implemented properly and legacy or outdated products. It points out that most medical devices cannot be monitored by an organization's intrusion detection system. And I've even seen that in a contract between a hospital and device maker that they sort of acknowledge this and are pushing responsibility onto the device maker for its own intrusion detection system. It's important to see how much medical device vulnerabilities are being communicated to healthcare providers and systems, and for device makers to see what healthcare systems are identifying as particular vulnerabilities. Device makers must have plans in place to address patching in their legacy devices in particular, and even though responsibility for cybersecurity should be equally shared among stakeholders, including the hospitals and healthcare systems, it's likely that device makers may face a disproportionate share of the blame should something go wrong. So these eventualities should be considered to the extent that they can in contracts between device makers and their customers. And we in risk management can certainly help you with that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kate, who will talk about the OTC Monograph reform.
Thank you. There are currently 2 ways to bring over-the-counter drugs to market, either using the typical drug application process, a new drug application or an abbreviated new drug application for a generic, or there is the monograph system. The NDA, the applications are private submissions to FDA by the drug sponsor. They have the same clinical data or other data to support the safety and effectiveness of the product, and it's reviewed by FDA in the same manner that a prescription drug application would be. This can be done if you have a new active moiety or a new dosage form, a new indication for use, or if you are looking to take a current prescription drug to over-the-counter status. The monograph process is completely different. It is a public rulemaking process that has 3 different phases. There is a review by an advisory panel, which creates a list of appropriate active ingredients for particular conditions. All of that information is drafted in a tentative final monograph, which FDA then publishes in the Federal Register. They have to hold open a comment period for a designated amount of time, and then they have to take all of the public comments and let those inform the final draft that is eventually published. The over-the-counter status, if you're following the NDA process, does not change the NDA obligations or costs. There are the costs of clinical trials, clinical data that you have to gather to support the application, as well as the user fee of over $1 million if there is no clinical data required, and over $2.5 million if there is clinical data required. On the monograph side, the methods for introducing new monographs move at an absolutely glacial pace. There are really only 2 options to change or introduce new monographs. If you're looking to make a change to an existing monograph, you can file a citizen petition with FDA, which is an official petition that FDA has to respond to. However, the response that FDA has to give in a certain period of time can be, we think this requires further study. So a non-answer can suffice as their answer to the citizen petition. The other option, if you're looking to add a new medical condition that would be covered by a monograph, is a time and extent application. However, that goes through the same 3-phase process where you have the advisory panel review, the drafting of a tentative final monograph, public comment, and then drafting and publishing of a final monograph before it can take effect. The entire process can take years. Monographs are intended to address a set of conditions that are self-limiting and lend themselves to easy self-diagnosis. It can be things like pain relief, or allergic reactions, or cuts or burns. Any of the drug products that you can pick up in a pharmacy off the shelves, those are going to be your OTC drugs, the majority of which are covered by monographs. The monographs themselves are incorporated into FDA's regulations, and they are based on the overarching condition. So for antihistamines, for example, that would be the name of the monograph. And then under that, you would have the active ingredients that FDA has designated as appropriate for use in monograph drug products, as well as the concentrations that they need to be in the final product. The inactive ingredients are up to the manufacturer as long as they are permitted ingredients on FDA's GRAS list, generally recognized as safe. The regulations also set forth all of the labeling that's required for over-the-counter drug products. It's everything from the active ingredients and their concentrations, the particular instructions for use, the warnings, the different types of warnings that are required, precautionary statements, where everything is placed on the label. It's all part of the regulation, right down to the specific phrasing options that are permitted. If a company is complying with the regulations set forth in the monograph, then they do not have to seek pre-approval from FDA in order to market their product. This is the drug facts label that I'm sure we're all familiar with. This is the required label that has to appear on all over-the-counter drugs, and nearly every aspect of it is dictated by FDA's regulations. Everything from the fonts that can be used, the font sizes based upon the size of the package, where things have to be bolded, how thick the lines have to be between the different sections, whether they can touch the outside border, where bullets should be used. All of that is dictated in the regulations. There is very little wiggle room for manufacturers of these products. Even the inactive ingredients and the way they appear, if you have, if your over-the-counter drug is a pain reliever like Tylenol, the active ingredients there are going to appear in order of the concentration in the product. Whereas if you're talking about a sunscreen or cosmetic product that has a drug aspect to it, those ingredients are going to appear in order of they're in alphabetical order, and all of the ingredients have to be listed under the name that is mandated in the directory of cosmetic ingredients. There is really no independent decision-making available to manufacturers of over-the-counter drugs. However, the monograph system really has become a relic. It was introduced in 1972. Some of the monographs were never finalized. They've been sitting in tentative status for decades. This uncertainty is often difficult for industry participants because the companies can they do have some wiggle room with regard to compliance if the monograph is in tentative form, but once the final version is published and becomes effective, then they're obligated to comply. So if something that has been sitting in tentative form for years and a company has been manufacturing a product in a particular fashion for all of those years, and then a final monograph is published and is not precisely the same as the tentative version, then the manufacturer may have to change its practices, its formulation, its labeling before it can continue to sell this product that they've been making for many years. In addition, because of the rulemaking process, this very slow pace is a problem in FDA's ability to respond to safety issues that arise. The manufacturers are bound by the regulations and how they draft the labels, so they're not able to make a unilateral change to the labels to address a safety issue that arises. FDA is bound by the notice and comment rulemaking procedures, so they're not able to unilaterally decide that the regulation can be changed to incorporate new warnings. And it really has become a significant barrier to innovation for both parties. Between the time and expense, as well as the inability to recover their investment in developing monograph products because of the lower prices associated with over-the-counter drugs versus prescription, there's very little incentive for manufacturers to invest in new OTCs. As a result, the available products, with the exception of newer products that have gone through the prescription to OTC switch, are largely products that have been available for nearly half a century. So there is legislation attempting to make its way through Congress that would reform this process. Some of the changes that have been that are addressed in the new legislation include the addition of user fees for over-the-counter drugs. These are never popular with industry, but they do provide a dedicated source of funding and staffing for over-the-counter drug product reviews, as well as improving the speed at which the agency can adapt to industry and any changes to products or warnings that they would need to add to products. which really does enhance their ability to maintain a safe marketplace for over-the-counter drugs. They have introduced in the legislation a streamlined regulatory pathway. So instead of using the notice and comment rulemaking procedure, they are shifting to administrative orders, which saves substantial time for FDA in reviewing proposed innovations as well as changes to the existing framework. They don't have to publish in tentative, wait for comments, incorporate comments, publish final. It becomes a much more direct approach like they have on the prescription side. In addition, this would allow them an much easier way to respond to emerging issues. Because, as we discussed, the manufacturers cannot change the labels once they are compliant with the monograph. If FDA had the ability to issue administrative orders to amend product warnings, it would save a significant amount of time in making that information available to customers directly on the product label. In addition to the streamlined pathway, they have also introduced an exclusivity period for innovators. So in exchange for developing a monograph, a manufacturer would have a specific period of time in which they could be the exclusive over-the-counter manufacturer under the monograph. This has gotten hung up a little bit in conference between the House and the Senate. They both agree that there should be an exclusivity period. I believe they're differing on the length of time, whether 18 months or 24 months. And finally, the legislation provides for IT infrastructure to support the program. This is a huge difference because all of the different programs for product approvals have much more robust systems on FDA's website to find information, to submit information. This would be a very user-friendly support mechanism for industry participants. Status of the reform is really uncertain at this point. It passed the House in the previous session, but was not taken up by the Senate before the session ended. It was passed again by the new Congress, which was just seated a couple of weeks ago. So this legislation passed again on January 8th. It really has garnered very wide support. It passed with 401 votes. It has now been sent again to the Senate, where we await further action. There's really no indication right now of how long or even if they will respond to the legislation at any time. And certainly there are pressing matters that are impacting their ability to take on topics like this at this point. And with that, I think we are ready for our lightning round.
Okay, the lightning round. Let's see. So this round, Kate and I will go back and forth, and we each just kind of selected some headlines that we've seen recently and how we think that'll impact the life sciences industry in 2009. So I'll kick it off here. Virtual trials. So in the clinical trials realm, these virtual trials are becoming more popular. They might ease the cost of clinical trials for drug and device makers, so that's what I see their importance as. This has really been enabled by changes in technology to facilitate, accessing remote patients with wearable monitoring tech devices, location tracking systems. The way this trial data is being recorded and transmitted has been proven to be both reliable and clinically meaningful. So it looks like these remote trials will be an increasingly viable option for life sciences companies. So this is an obvious import as the cost of undertaking clinical trials can be a barrier to entry for some in this industry. And allowing participants to be in different locations will certainly ease patient recruitment burdens, and it'll also allow the study of broader, more diverse populations. So I think this is a really positive development for our emerging drug and device companies?
Obviously, the government shutdown has been in the news quite a bit lately, and its impact on FDA could potentially be very significant as time goes on. Right now, the main impact seems to be on the Center for Foods because they are without independent funding that the drug and device centers have through user fees. So their ability to conduct food inspections has been severely limited, which should worry us all as consumers. On the drug and device side, however, because they do have the dedicated funding that comes from user fees, they've been able to stretch their operating status a little bit further. But that's not something that can continue indefinitely. So they are not able to accept new applications and new submissions of user fees at this time because they're not supposed to be working. So any new submissions that are on the horizon for companies could face unanticipated delay. Also, once the government is back up and running, there will likely be a glut of applications hitting the agency that they will have to work through in order to get back on track. So while some reviews that were existing prior to the shutdown have continued, new innovations, new applications are being impacted at this point.
Okay, I wanted to touch briefly on third-party litigation funding. We saw a lot of headlines on this last year. The New York Times in particular did a big write-up because it was found that in the pelvic mesh cases, a third-party litigation fund had actually been not only arranging a doctor and arranging surgeries, but paying for women to undergo what many in the medical field are unnecessary explant surgeries to sort of garner more plaintiffs and enlarge their plaintiff class. So this, what it is it's the practice of hedge funds investing money in lawsuits in exchange for a percentage of the settlement or judgment. So this has been done on a small and individual scale with, plaintiffs' attorneys operating on contingent fees, but now it's become a real movement of capital and a big investor in litigation. And they sort of operate in the shadows, and both courts have looked at this issue and said that it's not necessary for plaintiffs to disclose their funding sources, so it's difficult for us to grasp, how large this industry is. But at the end of 2017, the CEO of a pretty large litigation funding firm approximated that $100 billion was a reasonable estimate of the amount available to funders and firms. So what does this mean for life sciences industry? I think more litigation, suits of sort of questionable merit. In the pelvic mesh case, one of the women who were compensated for having their removal, the explant surgery, has a lawsuit pending against both the doctor and the litigation fund set up. It'll be interesting to see where that goes, because I think, maybe some rules will come out of that about disclosure, and maybe there'll be some, repercussions for these kind of practices. But right now, the life sciences industry is a really significant target for these organizations and something that we'll certainly be watching for in 2019.
In good news, this has been a banner year for drug approvals. There was a huge jump in the number of new drugs approved. The previous record was 50 in 1996, and there were 61 new drugs approved in 2018. A few interesting trends emerged from this data. First, the percent of the approvals that were obtained by Big Pharma dropped pretty significantly. They dropped to 26%, which is a 10-year low. It's normally in the 35 to 40% range of new drugs that are approved. There were 47 approvals for smaller firms, and 28 of these were to companies that had never had a drug approved before. The other interesting trend that we noticed was the focus on rare diseases. This is a goal of the 21st Century Cures Act, and in these approvals, we saw 31 targeted rare diseases. There were 13 different cancer drugs, 5 for metabolic diseases, 3 for blood diseases, 3 nervous system disorders, and 3 for infectious diseases. And all of these rare diseases had differing FDA special designations. So there were 31 orphan drugs approved this year. 26 drugs had priority reviews, 16 were fast-tracked by FDA, and 12 were designated as breakthrough therapies.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Looking next, HIPAA enforcement looks to be ramping up. It was sort of a banner year for that in 2018, and that would reasonably suggest that we can expect the same trend to continue in 2019. Last month in December, state attorneys general from 12 states joined to file suit against a medical software provider in the first ever multi-state data breach suit alleging HIPAA violations. So what does this mean? Device and software makers that deal with patient information need to be sure that they've implemented the industry standard or better security measures to protect personal health information. I expect to see more enforcement in this area.
There have been a lot of articles and pieces in the media this year about the 510K process. I think it is sometimes validly and sometimes through misunderstanding considered to be a non-review, a rubber stamp by FDA for products wishing to enter the market through that pathway. It has become a really difficult argument for industry to make that a 510K clearance is valid to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of the product. There have been articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post. There was a very disturbing documentary on Netflix, all of which make the case against 510K and its demonstration of safety. So we've seen that FDA has changed its position over the course of the year. They introduced the modernization of the 510K pathway earlier this year by touting the streamlining of the review process, the modernization. And by the end of the year, when they were talking about this advancement, it became an advance of the review of the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. So the spin they were putting on it was far more focused on the safety and efficacy of the devices rather than ease of use or least burdensome practices for manufacturers.
Okay, Brexit. So there was news on this just yesterday. The latest deal for the UK's leaving of the EU was just overwhelmingly rejected in Parliament. So as we inch closer to that March 29th date of when the UK is set to leave the EU, it's looking more likely that it's going to be a no-deal scenario with no withdrawal agreements in place or arrangements in place. So what does this mean for healthcare products market in the UK? The UK Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency just issued guidance, I think last week, as to how the UK is going to regulate medicines, devices, and clinical trials in the event that the no arrangement persists and the UK does leave in a no-deal scenario. Basically, so far they've said the MHRA would undertake the functions currently undertaken by the EU regulatory body for drugs. And for devices, UK will just continue to recognize devices approved for the EU market and CE marked. So that's what we know so far, but that'll be something we continue to watch for our device makers selling abroad. I think that concludes our lightning round. I really want to emphasize that both Kate and I and the risk management department are available should you have questions on any of the things we talked about today or anything else. It looks like we have just a couple minutes for questions, and I see that one came in. Let's see here. Looks like it might be for me. Is it true that a plaintiff can name any standard and win a case based on a company's failure to comply with it? So I'm glad I have the opportunity to sort of clarify that. I hope I didn't overstate it. I think, no, it's not true that as a matter of law, a plaintiff could say, this obscure industry organization put out these standards and you, device maker, failed to comply with them, and thus I'm entitled to relief. I think instead, plaintiffs can use these standards to show a jury that, look, there was this compliance standard that a device maker failed to comply with, and that suggests negligence on their part. Of course, then their defense attorney can say, well, this isn't widely adopted by the industry, or this isn't, the standard by which they should be measured against, and they'll have that opportunity to put that argument in front of the jury too. But I just wanted to bring up in this and kind of emphasize that often these industry standards and these regulatory guidances do form a basis for plaintiff's case, or rather a significant sort of notch in their argument that can be persuasive to a jury. Looks like there's a question for Kate.
So, given the shutdown, what is the impact going to be on inspections? So with the shutdown of the government, the inspection process has been slowed. Foreign inspections seem to be taking place on schedule, but the domestic inspections have slowed pretty dramatically. The impact on the industry itself should be, it could be used as an opportunity at this point. If you are working for a company that has had regulatory infractions in the past, or is trying to implement some new procedures to strengthen and enhance your quality operations, this would be a really great opportunity to do so. If you're knowing that you have a little bit of time before your next inspection, given that they're not happening on pace, you should be able to take advantage of that time to use your, to give your staff the ability to expand the work they're doing and better prepare for your next visit from FDA once they're back up and running. This might be looking at some of the end-of-year data from their previous inspections. What is FDA focusing on right now? What are the data integrity issues that could impact how your next inspection is conducted? Just to make sure you are on the right track for when they do show up on your doorstep. And hopefully that will limit any observations that you have following your next inspection.
All right, thank you. It looks like we're sort of out of time. But again, we emphasize, our availability. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. If you asked something and we didn't get to it today, don't hesitate to shoot us an email or give us a call, and we'd be happy to discuss anything in more detail. And I'll let Heather take it over from there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kate and Courtney, for presenting. We're anxiously awaiting what headlines will arise in 2019 and what you will do next year and what you'll represent. This concludes our webinar.